Hey y'all, Ben here, and today our lecture is going to concern various theories of morality and justice that are central to current controversies in LD debate. That is, we're going to talk through what the difference is, if there is one, between morality and justice, and how different theories or different philosophers of morality and justice have come to define the different types of frameworks that people run in debate rounds and what the consequences are of those. But our focus is really going to be on understanding these different conceptualizations of justice and morality. So this is going to be a little bit of a step back into broader philosophical discussion of what these different positions mean and what they look like, but we're going to focus here on positions that you'll commonly see or see more often than others, at least, in debate rounds themselves. So we're going to divide this discussion into two parts. The first part is going to talk about common positions that we see that specifically define morality or justice in certain ways. And then we're going to talk about more critical positions that people run that engage in either a definition of morality or justice that cuts against the grain of these common positions, or a definition of or a rejection of morality and justice, or a critique of morality and justice, or at least the way that it's traditionally defined. So, what we want to start talking about, though, is something that has been appearing across every lecture that we've given so far, but it's time for us to really break down and talk about what it means more specifically, which is we want to talk about, to begin with, the difference between consequentialism and deontology as frameworks of morality. And specifically, we're going to talk about what the difference is between what people usually call deontological frameworks and utilitarian frameworks, which are the most common versions of consequentialist frameworks that we see. So, to start off with, then, what is the distinction between consequentialism and deontology, and why is there a distinction between consequentialism and utilitarianism? So let's start out by talking about what consequentialism is. So the idea of consequentialism is that when you are asking whether something is moral or immoral, that you ought to look at the consequences of those actions to evaluate its morality. So, if I wanted to determine, for instance, whether it was moral or immoral for me to go to war, what I would look at is what the likely or anticipated consequences of me going to war are, as opposed to, for instance, my intentions when going to war. And that is the main way that we would contrast it with a deontological framework, is that a deontological framework is not about evaluating the consequences of an action per se, but is instead about evaluating the reasoning or foundation or principle behind those actions. And if the motivation behind the actions is good, or the reason you take the action is good, you are likely to affirm that the action itself is good, regardless of its consequences. So, that's the general distinction we want to draw to start with, is theories of morality that talk about consequences of actions being consequentialism, and theories of morality that do not deal specifically in the consequences of actions being deontology, where we look at the reasoning behind the action in order to determine whether it is true or false. Utilitarianism is a system that dates back to the 18th century that is typically attributed to Jeremy Bentham, who is a philosopher who is also famous for innovating the plans for the panopticon, which is a concept that will be famous for Foucault later, made famous by Foucault later in his critique of disciplinary justice. That's just kind of a sidebar, something interesting to think about when we start to think about how these theories of morality eventually feed into critiques of theorizing morality in this way. But to start off with, the utilitarian position is one that very simply says that in asking what a state or what an individual actor ought to do, the way that we ought to evaluate it is in terms of whether it causes more harm than good or more pleasure than pain. So we have this very simple calculus put into place where we actually have we call them units of the units that are used to evaluate this utils, where we count up the pleasure that is produced by a certain action and count up the pain the same action produces and weigh them against one another in terms of determining whether that action is moral or immoral. Now, there are a lot of questions that might raise that are legitimate questions that utilitarianism has to grapple with. So, one of the first ones might be, so when we talk about creating good or bad consequences, creating pleasure or pain, how do we define what is good or what is pleasurable? So, this definition of pleasure as being what utilitarianism aims at is meant to make that super biological and subjective. That is, it's about the individual and what the individual experiences as a consequence from a given action or a given principle being put into place. And you would weigh that against the suffering that other individuals feel. So, a famous utilitarian philosopher in the contemporary period is named Peter Singer, and he's an animal rights activist. And actually, what he takes from a utilitarian calculation is that we use pleasure and pain as a determination of moral action. So, anything that can feel pleasure and pain should be included in moral calculations. Now, that is something that is also, of course, debatable. But what we're getting at here is that when you are making moral calculations according to utilitarian standard, theoretically what you are trying to measure is the net happiness or pleasure something causes in comparison to the pain and the suffering or the loss that it causes. Now, that being said, there are generally two different ways or two different kinds of utilitarianism that are actually really different in terms of how they go about saying what is moral or immoral. And so the first one is act utilitarianism, and the second one is rule utilitarianism. And you'll hear people oftentimes abbreviate this around by calling it act util versus rule util. And so, what is the difference between the two? The first one says that morality is something that we adjudicate instance to instance. That is to say that in any given case that you are considering taking an action, that action will be independently weighted in terms of the net happiness versus pain it causes. So any given act, even if it's essentially the same act, could vary from time to time based on the consequences that it carried. So if I, for instance, according to this moral theory, push somebody out into, like if I push someone, let's say, in one circumstance, I would push them out of the way of traffic. And if I were to do that, that would obviously be utilitarian beneficial because whatever pain I caused by pushing them was negated by me saving their lives by pushing them out of traffic. But in an identical circumstance where I push that person and it doesn't save them from going into traffic, my action of pushing would then likely be immoral because I've caused pain rather than causing pleasure or saving somebody's life. So in this kind of circumstance, you can see that what a utilitarian moral calculus would call moral might oftentimes be shifting depending on contextual variables that mediate the outcome of that action. And so that is one popular response to act utilitarian positions, is that they cannot actually generate moral rules, that is, codes for us to live by, because there's so much complexity that goes into making the determination of whether any given act is moral that I could never know consistently what was immoral or what was moral in my day-to-day life, and I wouldn't be able to calculate those actions at all. So that is act utilitarianism. The second type of utilitarianism is rule utilitarianism. And so what rule utilitarianism does is try to make up for that deficit in act utilitarianism and say instead that when you are using a utilitarian framework to calculate what is immoral or what is moral, that what you should do is calculate what the aggregate or on average benefit versus harms of a given moral rule would be, and adopt the moral rules that, on balance, would cause more pleasure than pain, or would result in more good and more bad. So, or than bad. So, in that circumstance, you can see the relative appeal that if we're trying to establish moral rules for how individuals ought to govern themselves or ought to act in the world, that it's probably easier to do that if if the way that we approach it is by saying we ought to adopt those rules or those principles that on balance create more good than more bad. So in the first circumstance, you could see why how if you wanted to adopt a utilitarian framework into an affirmative position, what you would have to do is say the resolution is an act, and then you would demonstrate that the resolutional action is likely to bring about more good than harm in the instance that it's implemented. If you wanted to talk about rule utilitarianism, you would want to say that on balance, even though in specific circumstances it might have negative impacts, that implementing the rule would bring about more good than harm when generalized and done multiple times, done over and over and over again. So that's the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism, and that's a utilitarian framework in general. So we want to then go on to contrast this with a deontological framework. So deontological frameworks are actually a little bit older than utilitarian frameworks, and they're typically traced back to Kantian philosophy, being the writings of Immanuel Kant are one of the first places that we really see the term deontology being used, and one of the more rigorous theorizations of what morality is in earlier philosophy, or in early modern philosophy specifically. The main distinction that we've already put in place is that for deontology, we think about the reasoning behind a given action as opposed to evaluating it based on the consequences of its action. But this is not to be confused with saying that the intentionality of an act makes it right or wrong, and this is a common mischaracterization of deontology. So if people make this argument, you can respond in this way, is that the idea of that motivates an act is not what deontology is concerned with. It's not about whether you intended to be good or intended to be bad. Instead, deontology is about constructing a moral system that is based in reason. And this is Kant's fundamental argument. And so his idea that is oftentimes referred to when people are discussing deontology is what is called a categorical imperative. And so Kant's categorical imperative it says this. It says that any moral rule that a person adopts needs to be able to be maximalized, so turned into a maxim. So what he means by that is that it needs to be able to reasonably apply to every person who would be in a similar position and to every likewise action that we would evaluate in that given position. So what this is to say is that using our faculties of reason as subjects, there are certain things that we ought to determine should apply as protections in every instance that we would want to maximize. So a good example of this is lying. So Kant says that every reasonable person would want to turn the maxim "do not lie" into a moral rule, because in every circumstance that a person would lie, it would be in their interest, or they would reasonably want to think that another person ought not to. So they would think that a principle that applied to others would not apply to themselves, and that is inconsistent. So a consistent moral principle would be one that held in every given instance. So a development of a sufficient moral principle would be developing something that in every reasonable instance we would say would hold. So this is what deontology is then. It refers primarily to the idea that morality is attached to the human capacity for reason or for judgment. That it's all about rationality. That is your ability to disinterestedly and rationally construct what ought to be moral in every given instance. And you construct what ought to be moral in any given instance through the principle of non-contradiction. That is, if you were to say that X moral rule should be true, but X moral rule should not be true in a different given instance, you have contradicted yourself. And instead, what you need is a rational framework that would adopt moral rules that would hold in every instance. Now, what kinds of frameworks derive from this? Usually, the contemporary examples that we see for this are frameworks that either have to do with establishing rights-based frameworks, or frameworks that we would call side constraint frameworks that would simply say any moral system would necessarily have to do X by rational necessity. So we could say that X thing is a side constraint on all moral action, that any moral action would have to follow this side constraint. Two examples then. So the first one would be arguing for a rights-based framework derived from deontological frameworks. So what we've said about a Kantian deontological system so far is that it's based in the idea that that morality ought to be founded on an exercise of reason, and that exercise of reason should operate by taking a moral principle and asking whether it could be applied in all circumstances. That is, asking whether that moral principle could be adopted universally or without contradiction. Now, so one of the first moral principles then that Kant deducts from this idea is the idea that no individual should ever be treated as a means to an end. That no moral individual should ever be treated as a means to an end. And the idea here is that you secure something like individual rights, an inviolability of the person, from the idea that if we were to allow individuals to be treated as means to an end, it would necessarily result in contradiction, or could not be universally applied, because an individual treating another as a means to an end necessarily violates that individual's ability to treat that individual as a means to an end. So that is to say, if I exploit you, the necessity of that power relationship is that you can't reciprocally exploit me. So it would be impossible to universalize a moral system upon which one person could exploit another person to achieve a certain end. And in that circumstance, then we can start to devise things like rights. So we would ask, what does it mean to protect an individual from being treated as a means to an end? And any instance in which an individual was used as a means to an end would be something that violated a moral rule, that violated the categorical imperative, and therefore was immoral. What we can start to understand from this is that there's actually not much of a distinction between a rights-based framework and what we'll start to call a side constraint approach to morality. That is, if you violate X moral principle, X thing is automatically something that we would consider immoral. The main substance behind the distinction is that in the first case that we've been talking about, devising a theory of rights out of the idea that we can't treat people as a means to an end, you're going to be more specific about what you mean by negative rights, like a right not to be killed, like a right not to be stolen from, or have your free speech restricted. All of those things are more specific parameters of how you ought to treat people than just an idea that you ought to not treat people as a means to an end. So a lot of contemporary scholars will work from deontological frameworks to try to establish a rights-based framework that goes about protecting individuals from exploitation this way that we've been talking about. But the more general principle that an individual ought not to be treated as a means to an end is what we would call a moral side constraint, being a side constraint to action. So whatever you think the long-term benefits of something would be, you can never take an action that would exploit a person along the way to accomplishing that action. Now, this is one of the substantive beefs between utilitarianism and deontology. So in the first instance, utilitarianism does say there are many many instances in which what is correct is taking the action that would benefit the greatest number, even if that means sacrificing some individuals or using some individuals as means to an end. So, a classic example of this is what is called the trolley problem. So, in the trolley problem, the idea is that you're going down a trolley, a train track on a trolley, and up ahead, you're faced with a fork in the road. And in the fork in the road, you have an option. You can change the lever and intentionally kill one person, or you can take no action and kill three people. So a deontological framework would say that in that circumstances you are morally prohibited from taking action to save the greater number of people and calling that moral because you would be using one person as a means to an end. From a utilitarian framework, you would say that the opposite were true, that it would be fundamentally immoral for you not to flip the switch because you would be creating more suffering than harm, even if you would be taking an intentional action to hurt one person. So that is one of the main substantive distinctions between these things. So, moving then to talk about what it means to think about a side constraint as a framework more specifically, one of the distinctions that we could draw then is we could say that a side constraint based framework would be a framework in which we would say a violation of this fundamental tenet or principle of morality that makes morality consistent is sufficient to say that that action is immoral or is inconsistent with morality. So, let's give two examples of instances in which this could be true. So people oftentimes make this argument in terms of frameworks that talk about the protection of life or the inviolability of life. So we would say, for instance, along this line of argumentation, that any moral system is designed to maximize, or rather minimize, suffering to persons or to guide people to effectively interact with one another. Moral systems only matter because they think about human life as being valuable. If human life was not valuable, there wouldn't be any reason for moral systems because we could do whatever we wanted for each other. So if we have this in mind, that human life being valuable is a side constraint for morality, is what makes morality matter, then anything that demonstrated that human life was viable, could be violated as a means to an end, would fundamentally undermine the premise of morality, being that you ought to protect human life, or that human life is worth protecting. So this would be a side constraint type argument, where what you would say is that a fundamental logical prerequisite for a moral system, or rather that any moral system necessarily would have to not allow us to use each other as means as an ends or to violate persons in pursuit of positive consequences, because it would completely undermine or contradict the foundation of morality in general. So the second example we could give would be a translation of this to the rule of law. So Kant's ultimate argument is that what morality is obedience to moral maxims, that it is you abiding in every instance by what you reasonably know to be moral, and not changing your actions based on what is more expedient for you in a given circumstance. So, one of the fundamental consequences of this is that Kant thinks that people should be law abiding above almost all things. I mean, he 100% is critical of dogma in his time, but he thinks that individuals have to be subservient to the state's laws because the state's laws are a manifestation of that individual will, that state's laws are, or at least ought to be, grounded on maximalized moral principles, so individuals have to follow the law. And moreover, the idea that individuals have to follow the law is one of those moral maxims that we have to adopt, because if we said that individuals didn't have to follow the law in all circumstances, then we would necessarily end up in arbitrary moral ground where we were saying that there was an exception to the law, and that's not something that Kant permits. So that is the big, broad breakdown between utilitarianism and deontology is in the first circumstance, what we're doing is we're saying that we ought to weigh the empirical outcomes of a given action or of a given rule in order to determine whether it's moral or immoral. And in the second circumstance, we're saying that it doesn't matter what the discrete outcomes of anything are. What we need to do is adopt what we reasonably would say are moral rules people should follow in all circumstances, and if you violate those moral rules, it is immoral. Now, this brings us to, and this talk of side constraints brings us to one of the things that people do say in response to deontological frameworks a lot of times is that they are theoretically unfair. Because if you are negating and all you have to prove is something violates a moral side constraint, then it is very, very easy to prove that the resolutional action is unjust because actions violate side constraints all the time through implementation issues, among other things. So you'll see people oftentimes running theory type arguments against deontological frameworks that say that they skew ground because the affirmative has to prove in every instance that something is moral, where the negative only has to prove in one instance that it's not. So that is not something we have time to talk about too much today, but it's important to keep in mind that one of the places that this debate between deontology and consequentialism, or deontology and utilitarianism, is playing out is in terms of discerning whether or not there is a conflict, is in terms of determining whether there is a theoretically unfair advantage to running deontological frameworks, especially in order to prove that something is not moral. So, just something to keep in mind as something you might see, especially in more national circuit debate rounds. All of that has to do with what we're calling morality. And what we want to move to talk about in the rest of this lecture is whether there's a distinction or what the distinction theoretically is between morality and justice and why that might matter to us and what definitions of justice look like as distinct from morality. And we're just going to give a couple of quick examples, but this is an important distinction to keep in mind and something that we've talked about a little bit so far in our earlier lectures on values and value criterions. So, utilitarian and deontological frameworks are theoretically applicable to guiding state action, but are both originally theorized in terms of influencing what types of actions individuals ought to take. Utilitarianism is much more traditionally applied to state actors, but when people do talk about deontological approaches, a lot of times they apply them to state actors as well. But the fundamental distinction that we would want to posit if we wanted to draw one between morality and justice is that systems of morality are about governing how individuals act with individuals, whereas the systems of justice are primarily theorized in terms of state action and in terms of what the state codifies as being just for individuals to do, but also what it itself determines is just for its in terms of its own policies or its own actions or the things that it puts into place on the ground. So the distinction that we're drawing generally then is that when we talk about morality, a lot of times what we're talking about is ethics, something subjective and belonging to the individual. And when we're talking about justice, what we're oftentimes talking about is what it is just for the state to do, or how the relationship between the state and the individual gets defined in a given political area. So the most famous positions that you'll see that have to do with justice as opposed to morality, are what we would call contractarian positions. And these come out of Enlightenment philosophy dating back to Kant, is heavily influenced by Kant, but oftentimes take a much more political theory approach to theorizing the problems of the state and the individual in relationship to the state, and aren't talking about morality in the abstract. So the idea behind contractarianism in general is that there's kind of an origin story to the emergence of the state, where Locke, Rousseau, and Hobbes, who are early statesmen of contract-based theories of governance, all think that there's something called the state of nature. And the state of nature is individuals as they existed before the development of governments. citizens. Now, for different reasons, these three philosophers all theorize that individuals come together and form a state government, and what happens when they form a state is that individuals sacrifice a given amount of freedom for given protections from the state. But they have really different ideas of how this happens. So, for instance, Hobbes is famous for writing this text called the Leviathan. And his idea is that individuals necessarily are anarchic, like meaning they are unlawful, they hurt each other when left to their own devices. Hobbes famously says that in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, and short. So Hobbes thinks that individuals are bad at base. Somebody like Rousseau or Locke is more likely to think that individuals are reasonable and rational agents and come together to form the state's protection, or come together to form the state out of a rational motivation to align their interests with the people around them. But despite these distinctions, they have similar ideas that when individuals come together to form the state in this way, that they give up some freedom and therefore are guaranteed protections from the state. So, contractarian positions oftentimes are form or provide for rights-based frameworks to determining whether something is just or unjust. Does X action protect individual rights? Does X action violate constitutional rights of individuals that are put in place by the state? But the logic behind a rights-based framework here is very different, because instead of saying the rights-based framework comes from something essential to the individuals, it says that the rights-based framework comes from a specific relationship sustained between the individual and the state. And that means that the state necessarily has to follow laws, but it also means that the state's constraints on the state's ability to act and the things that the states can do to the people under its jurisdiction apply to its citizens through a contract that they form, and therefore may, for instance, not apply to non-citizens, which is an argument that people have made on topics related to the rights of immigrants in the United States, for instance. So we have to think about this idea of justice as being different than any idea of morality. One, because it's linked back to this contractual relationship between the individual and the state, and two, because it doesn't claim that there's something that holds in any given circumstance, like that there's a justice that would be true for all given states, but says that justice is specifically something that's formulated in the relationship between the individual and the state. The second type of contractarianism argument that I want to talk about, which is different but is based in a similar sort of ethos, is what we would call liberalism. And liberalism is most popularly defended or theorized by somebody who's very popularly cited in debate named John Rawls and his idea of the veil of ignorance. So let's talk about liberalism a little bit before we move on to talk about some of the more critical takes on these ideas of justice and morality. So liberalism, according to Rawls and according to its previous theorists, is the idea that at base individuals are competitive and that states come into place in order to sanction competition between individuals, which allows them to put in place the best possible given system. So a pure, what we would call a laissez-faire, hands-off style of liberal government, then, is a fundamentally capitalist one, usually, in which individuals have rights, have negative rights that protect their ability to compete with one another, but have no positive rights. That is, they aren't guaranteed any welfare from the state, but instead, the idea is that individuals just need to be protected so that they can compete against one another in order to achieve ideal aims. So the question is, what are those negative protections? And this is where Rawls' idea of justice comes in. And Rawls says that what we should do as a thought experiment government, whenever we're trying to determine whether something ought to be a right or a rule ought to be applied in a liberal society, is we ought to put ourselves behind a veil of ignorance. That is, we should say that we don't know from our own subjective positions we don't know what our position in a given society would be. We don't know whether we would be rich or poor, or whether we would be black or white, or whether we would be a man or a woman. We don't know any of these things. And so we should guarantee rights to people that would be most likely to guarantee justice to those people without consideration of our own position or our own skin in the game. Now, it's really important, I think, because a lot of times people mispresent Rawls as being a person who is primarily a theorist of rights and therefore would advocate for things like a redistribution economy. But Rawls is actually 100% in favor of systems that allow for competitions to be competition between individuals. He is a dedicated liberal. He just thinks that rights need to be a side constraint on liberalism, where other liberal theorists, and especially conservative or libertarian theorists, do not think that we should put these external constraints on individual competition and think that individuals should establish what is just and moral in their society through this internal competition that mimics itself or is implemented in terms of liberal governance. So, these theories are a little bit more complicated, and obviously if you wanted to learn more about them and learn about their nuances, you would probably need to do more research and in-depth reading about them. But the main thing that I want to suggest here is that these are different theories than theories of morality, because all of them are focused on what would make a just state, which is something that we oftentimes see as a term of art in debate resolutions. They're all focused on what it means for the state to be just or what it means for the state to be unjust. So, that is the basic distinction we want to draw, and you'll see a lot of different types of contractarianism arguments floated around that have to do with more about the rule of law or more about the relationship between the individual and the state and the protection of rights, but for now, this is a sufficient summary of the distinction between how we'll oftentimes see morality and justice fleshed out. I want to then move on very quickly to talk about different types of critical theories of morality that are popular in debate rounds now and that have been popular in debate rounds historically that take what we're saying and just push it in a slightly different direction. So the first thing that I want to talk about is Foucault, who I mentioned earlier in this lecture, who is a famous theorist of justice and ideology. When both of these make there are critical distinctions between these positions, but both of these make similar arguments. So Foucault argues that the state is what fundamentally defines the conditions for justice, because what is determined to be just or unjust is a particular connection or articulation between a regime of knowledge and a regime of power. And what this means is that those who are in power support with them a certain regime that allows them to stay in power, which is based on the definition of knowledge, what is true and false, and justice, what is right and wrong. So Foucault 100% thinks that there is a such thing as justice, but he doesn't think that justice is what is necessarily good for a state to do. He thinks that justice is defined in the state's own self-interest and through the operations of the state's power. So this is very much related to contractarian positions, but as opposed to theorizing the existence of a just state as the same as a morally good state, what Foucault wants to say is that justice is always an operation of power, so what we call just could actually be a really bad thing from an independent moral perspective. Ideology makes a similar argument, but expands it to cover morality as well. So for ideology, notions of justice or for ideological critique, so coming out of Marxism, what we know of as being justice and morality typically is something that is held in place by state power to justify the continuation of its economic base being typically capitalism. So systems of morality, Marx would argue, are ways in which we define right and wrong that ultimately always end up serving capitalist interests. Now, Marx does believe in a type of revolutionary ethic that people should rebel against the capitalist system, and that would bring on something that we might call normatively or morally better, but Marx doesn't write about morality in that way. For Marx, ideology critique is a form of critiquing all of the things that stand between us and conceiving what we rationally need to do to break out of the oppression that capitalism puts into place, and part of that is rejecting rationalist or bourgeois ideas of morality or justice. So the idea behind both of these arguments, then, is that morality is fundamentally connected to power, is not something that is abstractly good, and the same thing for justice. Now, finally, this next type of position that I want to talk about is something that is similarly critical of ideas of morality and justice, and perhaps applies most strongly to Kantian versions of justice. And these are arguments associated with the anti- or decolonialist positions, critical race theory, and what is oftentimes popularly referred to as Afro-pessimism. So, Wilderson being the most popular example of these positions in contemporary debate, as far as I know of, as being these three types of theories are theories that all indict Western philosophy and Western conceptualizations of morality and justice as being founded on imperialism, founded on colonialism, founded on racist oppression, and in Wilderson's argument specifically, all of rational or civil society is based on this fundamental oppression of Black individuals that we cannot escape, that it is impossible for us to overcome and say, yes, we still somehow know what is moral or immoral, even though our whole tradition of thinking through these things is based on racism. And Kant is a great example of this, because Kant was a racist. His writings on other countries are fundamentally biologically racist about the racial superiority of white people. So him centering rationality or reason as where we get moral theories from is necessarily exclusionary of Black people in his own writing, because he thinks that they are irrational. And many other scholars make similar accusations about rationalist criteria for determining what is moral and what is immoral, because rationality is a very strict and normative model about how people ought to think that doesn't apply to all cultures, and that has been policed at the exclusion of women, people of color, LGBTQ plus populations, etc. So these theories are political critiques of rationality and reason-based frameworks that are based in these strains of thought that want to point out the way that morality is imbricated in ideas of power and is imbricated in racist pasts. And then the last two positions that we want to talk about briefly are moral skepticism and moral relativism. So these are things that people talk about a lot, but oftentimes conflate the two, and I just want to give you a distinction between the two of them before we close in this crash course on different theories of morality. So, skepticism is the idea that morality or justice as concepts do not exist or are not things that we can reasonably talk about. So the best example of this is something that derives from logical positivism, which is a strain of philosophy popular in the United States. And logical positivism oftentimes makes the following argument. It says, that for any given logical proposition, X is moral. There would have to be something in the world, a truth maker, that we could refer to, something empirical and concrete, where we could say, yes, X thing is moral. I see that it has this morality as its quality. But because morality is intangible, there's nothing in the world that we can point to and say, yes, this is moral. We can never make moral propositions as truth claims, that morality is really something like a feeling or an aesthetic response or something emotional, but is not something that we can make true or false claims about, ever. That is skepticism. Morality doesn't exist because we can't experience it. And then secondly is relativism, and the most popular version of this being cultural relativism, which says that morality does exist, but it is something that is socially constructed within given societies. So what is moral varies from place to place. So in this, when people run moral relativist positions, what they oftentimes say is that the resolution is a categorical proposition. So in all cases, civil disobedience is morally justified. But you can't say that because in some cases it's not, like in cultures where they disapprove of civil disobedience or where they perceive of civil disobedience as immoral, would be an example. So relativism says that there are multiple and contradictory versions of morality, and we can never arbitrate them or square them with one another. So obviously there are different kinds of ways we would go about responding to positions like these. We do not have time to talk about responses to skeptical positions now. This is something that you could talk to your other instructors about in more detail if you'd like to, but that distinction is really, really important. Because in the first case, we could never prove the truth of a moral proposition, but in the second case, we could at least say that a moral proposition held to be true in some instances. So if you were running, for instance, a plan that specified the resolution into the United States, you could probably prove that that was moral contextually, even if relativism were true. Whereas a skeptical position, you could just never prove a moral claim true. So the ground is really different then in terms of how these positions work. So I hope that this was a helpful crash course on morality and justice, and I'll talk to y'all next time.